Right balance with human milk. My name is Andy Markel. I'm a neonatal dietitian and the Director of Clinical Nutrition and Medical Science Liaisons at Prolacta Bioscience. I'll be your moderator today. Our presenters for today's webinar are Dr. Erin Hamilton-Spence and Emily Kanata. Dr. Hamilton-Spence is a board-certified neonatologist and lactation consultant. She has practiced in multiple neonatal intensive care units, including Cook Children's Medical Center and Baylor Scott and White Health. At Pediatrics Medical Group of Texas, Dr. Hamilton-Spence has been an attending neonatologist and lead physician for the Breast Milk Continuous Quality Improvement Initiative and currently chairs the Department of Critical Care at Cook Children's Medical Center. She founded the Gastrointestinal Rehabilitation Adaptive Care and Education Team in 2020 and currently sits as a Director of Clinical Education and Professional Development for Prolacta Bioscience. Emily Kanata is a registered dietitian nutritionist with over 20 years of experience in neonatal and pediatric clinical nutrition. She has worked in a variety of roles ranging from bedside clinician to hospital management. As a clinician, she worked primarily in the NICU, PICU, and pediatric cardiology patient populations. While in the Director of Clinical Nutrition role, Emily created a centralized milk preparation room, implemented the exclusive human milk diet, as well as barcode scanning for human milk. Emily is an author in the most recent Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics book, Infant and Pediatric Feedings, Guidelines for Human Milk and Formula in Healthcare Facilities. Before we begin our event, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. For best connection, please use Google Chrome and close any open browser windows during the live presentation. Use your computer speakers or phone to adjust your volume. If you have a question for our presenters today, you can submit it at any time during the presentation in the Ask Question section of your webinar console. Download available slides and handouts in the Related Content section. To receive your continuing education certificate, you must meet the following criteria. Watch at least 35 minutes of the presentation, submit your webinar evaluation in the webinar evaluation section, and submit your post-test in the take test section. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on demand at prolacta.com. We will now begin today's webinar, Early Protein for Extremely Low Birth Weight Infants, Striking the Right Balance with Human Milk. We encourage you to stay until the end, where I, Andy Markel, will be joined by Dr. Erin Hamilton-Spence and Emily Kanata for a live Q&A panel along with our guest, Kim Mack.
Here are our objectives for today's webinar: to describe the current guidelines for parenteral and enteral protein intake, appraise the differences between term, preterm, and donor human milk and how that impacts protein delivery to the baby, and explain how early fortification using exclusive human milk optimizes early protein provision. These are our disclosures. I'm Emily Kanata.
And I'm Erin Hamilton-Spence.
We're both current employees of Prolacta Bioscience and have independently prepared this presentation.
The photos and diagrams you see in this presentation are for educational purposes only, and they're not recommendations for any particular product. Next, we are going to describe the current American Association of Pediatrics and SBGAN guidelines for parenteral and enteral protein intake. As we take care of neonates in the ICU every day, we decide nutritional requirements for very low birth weight and extremely low birth weight infants to prevent cumulative nutritional deficits soon after birth. The goal of these parameters is to improve growth early in the NICU stay and to facilitate achievement of prescribed normal weight, length, head circumference by the expected date of delivery or by the time of hospital discharge. We pay special attention to gestationally dependent needs for total energy, protein, calcium, and phosphorus. In this publication by Lapillon from 2013, notice the gestational age minimum cited is less than 28 weeks. In this example, guidelines often stop near the lowest gestation with good evidence. And we continue to care for these patients despite the fact that good evidence is not available. Additionally, as neonatologists, we use the term protein very loosely. We refer to all parenteral and enteral amino acid-based provision as protein. However, this is not the case. Parenteral protein, IV protein, consists of amino acids, carefully chosen to approximate the needs that would be infused via the umbilical cord if the patient were still in utero. In this review by Nicholas Embleton from 2019, you'll see that trophimine is the primary source of protein in many neonatal units, and this was designed with breast milk in mind so that the amino acids would mirror those available in breast milk. Keep in mind that an amino acid is similar to a pearl on a string of pearls. That individual pearl does not necessarily equate function, though it is an essential building block in that long functional string of pearls. The actual protein itself is the entire string put together that fits in a specific way and forms a specific function. As we move to enteral protein, the scope is entirely different, and protein is the correct term here. Lonerdahl and colleagues reminded us in this review from 2017 of the major protein components of human milk thought to be in sufficient quantities to have bioactive function in the neonate. Of course, our goal in the NICU is to find the best way to deliver these proteins to retain their functional capacity for the very preterm infants. In this way, the protein content of human milk is about more than the macronutrients. It's also about optimizing the diverse interactive systems in our patients' bodies that can be regulated or enhanced by these message-carrying proteins. This includes diverse benefits such as improved digestive capacity, immune function, pain control, infection prevention, and brain function and development. Even if you have been aware that human milk as a better option for your patients, you may not yet have appreciated this level of detail. To make matters even more complicated, the protein itself can be broken into two different large components. You'll see on the left the terminology crude protein. This is the same as gross protein or total protein. This contains all of the nitrogen of the non-protein nitrogen as well as the protein. And while this difference may not be vast in cow milk-based or in dairy milk-based diets, in human milk-based diets, this difference may actually be very meaningful. In cow milk, there is only less than 5% of the crude protein is non-protein nitrogen. However, in human milk, the non-protein nitrogen component is 20 to 25% of the total protein. This difference may be significant when comparing a human milk diet to a diet that is composed of portions of dairy milk. And then on the right, you see the term true protein. This is the protein that we count as nutritive protein. This is the protein that you can break down and digest and can be measured directly or calculated from the nitrogen content. You can see the equation most commonly used to find the true protein value of human milk. That is taking the total nitrogen minus the non-protein nitrogen, multiplying by the Caldwell factor, which is 6.25, to get you the true protein value of human milk. This is the portion that actually will give you that nutritive protein that you're after and the guidelines that you write for your patients. There's lots of great work around why early protein provision matters, and some of it focuses on parenteral provision of protein and some on enteral provision of protein. In New Zealand, they're working together to bring these things to an understanding that will help us all. Barbara Cormack and her group out of Australia and New Zealand have put together this great early work about optimizing early nutrition and really the influence that it can have on all the different pieces of development. So if nutrition health is brain health, human milk really gives you the best capacity to do this. This wonderful, about 20-page review from 2019 and from Nutrients in 2019 really raises as many questions as it answers, and I encourage you to go looking for it to read it. Interestingly, one of the most fascinating things I found from the review is that there may be different needs for boys versus girls. So I hope you find the time to go read that. And then, of course, Cormac and her group and Dr. Bloomfield, also out of Australia and New Zealand, have put together the amino acid, the early amino acid trial that was in the New England Journal this last year. Instead of talking about that trial, I'm going to point to a publication by Cormac that came out about a year before, and some of the signals they were seeing on this early provision of an additional gram of amino acid per day for infants. This is a wonderful citation that can teach many of us about what is refeeding syndrome in preterm infants, and may help us understand that increasing our IV protein, also known as amino acid provision, in the first week of life may not be the best answer. So there appears to be a causative relationship between early high protein provision that the infant cannot utilize and electrolyte imbalances. This schematic takes you through how a high amino acid intake, if you're just looking at the gray box in the middle, how a high amino acid intake will increase insulin production and stimulate glycogen, fat, and protein synthesis. That increases the uptake of phosphate, potassium, and magnesium into cells for energy in this protein synthesis. And an under-provision of electrolytes, specifically phosphate and potassium and magnesium, can actually lead to many difficult consequences downstream. This neonatal refeeding syndrome can be seen especially high in small for gestational age babies. So this is a side effect of high early parenteral amino acid provision that may as yet be underappreciated in neonatology as a whole. Next, I'm going to pass it over to Emily to talk a little bit more about early protein provision.
Thanks, Erin. And what I want to talk about a little bit more now is the importance of early enteral nutrition in particular. So this paper by Nakanishi is a retrospective cohort study out of Japan, where they looked at babies less than 32 weeks of age, and they studied almost 14,000 infants until age 3. They evaluated these babies for neurodevelopmental outcomes, including cerebral palsy, home oxygen therapy needs, and visual, hearing, and cognitive impairments. And what they found is that babies that were reaching full enteral feedings sooner had a lower prevalence of these abnormal long-term neurodevelopmental outcomes. And then in the study by Schneider, this is a single center study out of Switzerland, and they did serial MRIs at certain time points and compared those serial MRIs to the nutrition intake in the first 2 weeks of life. And what was extremely interesting to me here is that higher enteral macronutrient intake during those first 2 weeks predicted enhanced brain development, and that brain growth during the preterm period predicted psychomotor outcomes at 18 months of age. Let's look at the recommendations for protein intake, starting with parenteral nutrition. Here we have references from Koletzko, Espagin, the American Academy of Pediatrics, which cites an older same reference from 2005, and the American Society for Parenteral and Enteral Nutrition. All of these giving us a range somewhere between 3 to 4 grams of protein per kilo per day. However, the benefit of providing greater than 3.5 grams per kilo from parenteral nutrition remains unclear. And actually, the Espagin 2018 guidelines, they recommend reserving doses greater than 3.5 grams per kilo from parenteral nutrition for clinical trials. Ideally, the baby is not on parenteral nutrition for very long, and it's only used as a short-term bridge until feeding can be established. For enteral nutrition, we've included 4 of the more current references for protein intakes here, including the newest Espagin guidelines that were just published. We also have Let's Go from 2021, the AAP's newest version of the Pediatric Nutrition Handbook, which actually references Let's Go 2014, and then ESPGHAN's previous recommendations from 2010. They all list a goal range of 3.5 to 4.5 grams of protein per kilo per day, but there are some nuances. What I found really interesting is the new ESPGHAN from 2022 recently changed the recommendation to say most preterm infants will need 4 grams of protein per kilo. And in the absence of other causes of growth failure, at that point, you can consider going up to 4.5 grams of protein per kilo. And I know there are many units out there pushing protein intakes up to 5 grams or even further than 5 grams per kilo on paper. And we can talk a little bit more about the variability of nutrients in human milk and how that impacts the baby's actual intake later on. Another interesting thing to note about ESPGHAN's new recommendations is in their energy chapter, they recommend a protein energy ratio goal of 2.8 to 3.6 grams of protein per 100 calories. And using a protein energy ratio may give you some information about the balance of nutrients. However, it does have limitations and it should not be used in isolation. You still need to be within the goal range for both protein and energy. For example, you could be underfeeding or overfeeding and still have a protein energy ratio within the recommended range.
Thank you, Emily, for that important groundwork. Now let's talk about how the differences, the variability in human milk itself actually makes it very challenging to hit these goals on a consistent basis. Now we will talk about the variability of protein in human milk. This meta-analysis by Gidrowitz from 2014 included 41 papers looking at nutrient composition of preterm and term breast milk. This is one of the few publications listing true protein instead of total protein. Preterm milk was higher in true protein than term milk, and the maximum mean differences of up to 35%, which is 0.7 grams per deciliter in the first few days after birth. And after postnatal day 3, most of the differences in true protein between preterm and term milk narrowed quite a bit to less than 0.2 grams per deciliter. And further on, by weeks 10 to 12, estimates suggest that term milk may be the same as preterm milk at that same age. With milk maturation, there's a notable narrowing of the true protein variance in preterm milk from the wide estimate of 0 to 5.7 grams per deciliter to plus or minus 2 standard deviations in colostrum to the narrower mature milk estimated at 0.6 to 1.4 grams per deciliter at 12 weeks. You can see easily from this analysis, milk in the first 2 weeks has a much wider variation in the protein content than later milk. However, even later milk shows wide variability when considered on a population basis. I had the good fortune to be part of this study published in PLOS ONE in 2019. Our purpose was first to describe the macronutrient variability in human milk and how it contributes to the ability to meet protein and caloric targets for the preterm infant using fortification with commercially available fortifiers. Number 2, to assess how a temporal or time effect versus an individual or subject effect actually explains some of this macronutrient variability. And third, to determine how macronutrient variability contributes to the nutrient distribution in a pooled milk of donors. We analyzed over 1,100 donor milk samples from over 300 donors who were all more than 4 weeks from birth. You can see our median value of 1 gram per deciliter fits nicely with nearly all feeding guidelines for very preterm infants and with Gidrowitz analysis in the previous study. When you look closely at the histogram on the left, the range for protein is from 0.6 to 2 grams per deciliter. Additionally, the histogram on the right shows the range of caloric density of donors with a median of 18.7 kilocalories per ounce and a range of 10.8 kilocalories per ounce to 27.5 kilocalories per ounce. Lastly, human milk fat actually accounts for most of the variability between individuals, with the mean being 3.5 grams per deciliter, but the range is widest from 0.7 to 7.1 grams per deciliter, quite a wide range. So human milk fat, this is not shown on this slide, but human milk fat does contribute to most of the variability in human milk. Each 1 gram per deciliter decrease in the fat content of human milk translates into a reduction of 14.4 kilocalories per kilo per day at feeding volumes of 160 mils per kilo per day. That's important, and I'm happy to share that with you from this publication later if you'd like. While these findings contribute to the study I just mentioned from Gidrowitz, I think the most important piece is that second part that's described. Because I myself, one of the authors, continue to struggle with the complexity and how to convey it, I'm going to use a soccer analogy to aid in our understanding. If you'll bear with me just a moment. While protein content and total intake can be very helpful to judge the soundness of a feeding guideline, the outcome, of course, that we are interested in is the actual infant, and not just growth, but development. If this is the only piece of data we're evaluating, that's similar to judging a football game, a soccer game, for those of you in the US, match by the possession time instead of by the goals scored. It's an interesting, but ultimately not the most important piece of data. Further, in the same paper, we analyzed how fortification would affect the protein and calorie content of donor milk. Commercial fortifiers were placed into 3 categories: base, intermediate, and high. The base fortifier, when concentrated to 24 kilocalories per ounce, would increase protein content by 1 gram per deciliter. This fortifier was Similac human milk fortifier concentrated liquid. The intermediate fortifiers add 1.5 grams per deciliter of protein. This description would fit both Similac human milk fortifier hydrolyzed protein concentrated liquid, or HPCL, as well as the Prolact plus 6 human milk-based human milk fortifier. Lastly, we built in a high fortification assumption. This is Prolact 10 that would increase the protein content by 2.5 grams per deciliter. The macronutrient profile of each donor was used to compute feeding volumes necessary to achieve 3.5, 4, 4.5, and 5 grams per kilo per day. These are the target goals that you're aiming for in your feeding guidelines. Similarly, feeding volumes necessary to achieve calorie targets of 110 and 135 kilocalories per kilo per day were also computed. Median daily feeding requirements ranged from about 150 to almost 250 milliliters per kilo per day with basic protein fortification. From about 130 to about 200 milliliters per kilo per day with intermediate protein fortification, and from about 100 to about 140 milliliters per kilo per day with high protein fortification. Box and whisker plots illustrate the distribution of feeding volumes required to reach various protein and calorie targets using fortified, transition, and mature milk. Over 75% of mature milk samples fortified with a basic protein fortifier did not meet daily protein targets of 3.5 grams per kilo per day without exceeding volumes of 160 mils per kilo, even in transition milk. When protein targets increase to 4.5 grams per kilo per day, feeding volumes must exceed 160 mils per kilo per day in the majority of samples using intermediate protein fortifiers. High protein fortification could meet all protein goals in all samples at feeding volumes below 160 milliliters per kilo per day. This is a deep dive into the protein variables we are trying to balance as we make feeding plans for our patients. You can see that the destination is clear. These targets of 3.5, 4, 4.5, 5, and sometimes higher grams per kilo per day are absolutely clear. These are the recommendations. However, getting there is not so simple. This kind of unknown variability becoming known can be very disconcerting. It's a bit like taking a road trip in a friend's car with a broken gas gauge. You have no idea how big the tank is or how much gas is in the tank. But you do know where you want to get. You do know the destination. So you will do your best to control the things you can control, such as how much gas you put in the tank and what kind it is. So if there's a type of gas that optimizes your gas mileage, chances are you'll choose that because it's a variable that you can control. So you won't run the risk of putting too little gas in the tank. Similarly, if you're aware that your baseline assumptions of a fixed amount of protein may not be quite so fixed, you can make more informed choices about how to fortify your human milk to the benefit of your patients. So you can see that based on exactly what you're feeding, your fortification goal might vary. And then to add a little more complexity to the mix, it also depends how you measure the milk. So there are different ways to actually measure and label macronutrients, so fat, protein, carbohydrates, and how to derive those energy values based on the instrument that you use. So Dr. Perrin, again, and her laboratory in North Carolina, we had 10 different donors and analyzed their samples in 5 different ways. Importantly, the MARZO is the machine that is used most often if you're making, it's of course at this moment not yet actually labeled for clinical use, though that is my guess is that it is being used in a clinical way, not just for research at this point. If you're analyzing milk in your unit, most likely you're using a MARZO. And you should know that the MARZO, even based on their own user manual, they actually report both gross and total protein, but their report may be a little bit higher than you would expect. So I believe you have to choose what to read out, and you should know that you might be using total protein in your equation instead of nutritive protein. And that difference can make a big difference. A 20% difference or 3 kcals per ounce could be certainly clinically significant for a preterm infant that you're trying to set really tight goals for. And lastly, it's not just macronutrients, but also micronutrients that are kind of hard to meet. After I had left our collaboration, Dr. Perrin went on to do more publications about the micronutrient content and variability of donor milk. And this publication was just out last year, January of 2022, about the sodium content of donor milk and how it can be hard to reach the goal. So if this is the recommended level, you can see between the 2 lines is the place where is the recommended amount of sodium for preterm infants in the range who would be receiving both human milk and these fortifiers. You can see unfortified milk here, Similac 24 here, Enfamil 24 here, and this is Prolacta's kind of base fortifier, Prolacta 6. And you can get within the range of recommended amount of sodium with different fortifiers. Milk banks do what they can to reduce this variability, and you can see that as they add more donors to the pool, this variability narrows and makes it more likely that you're going to hit that goal of 4.5 grams per liter of sodium. So there is there are some things that we do to mitigate this variability, but it's important to know that it's out there when you're seeing challenges with your own infants. So now we will move into some more practical applications of how early fortification with an exclusive human milk diet really makes that early protein provision a lot more viable. And I'll start with just the example of my own feeding guideline. I'm a neonatologist in Fort Worth, Texas, with the pediatrics group. We last updated our feeding guideline in 2021, but we've got a new update coming soon. This is an example of what in prolactin, we would say this is an early fortification. So you can see we fortify with Prolacta 6 at about 50 mils per kilo per day after you've had some trophic feeding for a little while based on your birth weight. And then we, at the moment, don't proactively use cream, though you could argue that that might be a smart next move for us. But we're hitting our TPN protein goals and weaning them down by adding this early parenteral protein. Next, I'm going to hand it over to Emily to talk a little bit more about practical protein goals in feeding guidelines.
Thank you, Dr. Hamilton-Spence. Here's another example of a protocol that facilitates improved early enteral nutrition. This protocol was designed for a high-risk premature infant, whatever that means to you, and has a slower feeding advancement for the first few days of 10 mLs per kilo per day. Then, assuming tolerance, the feeding advancement increases to 20 mLs per kilo per day. Fortification of mom's own milk and/or donor milk using a human milk-based fortifier to provide 26 calories per ounce starts at 60 mLs per kilo per day feeding volume. And then by day 10, full feeds of 160 mLs per kilo are reached. Taking the protocol we just reviewed, which is represented by the blue line, let's compare it against another published feeding protocol by O'Connor from 2018. That one is represented by the purple line. On this graph, the x-axis represents days, and the y-axis is volume of feeds in mLs per kilo. In the O'Connor study, the first day of fortification was greater than or equal to 120 mLs per kilo per day, and they used cow's milk fortifier at 22 cows per ounce or a human milk-based fortifier at 24 cows per ounce. At 140 mLs per kilo per day, the calorie concentration was increased, and they defined full feeds as 160 mLs per kilo. Clearly, there's a dramatic difference in the amount of enteral nutrition provided by the blue versus the purple protocol. For the baby on the blue protocol, fortification occurs 8 days sooner, and full enteral feeds are reached an entire week earlier than the baby on the purple protocol. And remember, this is occurring during that critical time period, that first 2 weeks of life, where the amount of enteral macronutrients and the time to full enteral feeds may impact neurodevelopmental outcomes, as we discussed earlier in this presentation. We know this early fortification is possible and safe when you're using exclusive human milk. And let's look at the numbers a different way. Here we've taken a comparison of those two protocols and translated it into how many enteral calories and protein a baby would receive on days 1, 5, 7, 10, and 14. I'm going to refer to the blue protocol as the early fortification protocol, and that's going to be represented on top in blue. And then the O'Connor or the purple protocol numbers are on the bottom. I may also refer to that as the late fortification protocol. And just note that we assumed human milk was 20 calories per ounce and 0.9 grams per deciliter of protein. As you can see here on day 1, there is little difference in intakes. However, by day 5, the early fortification protocol is providing significantly more enteral nutrition, almost 70% more calories and 85% more protein. That gap continues to widen as the days progress. On day 10, the blue protocol baby is at full feeds and getting 3.8 grams per kilo of protein enterally, whereas the baby on the purple protocol is only getting 10% of their protein from feeding. And then on day 14, the late fortification or the purple protocol still only providing about half of the enteral protein goal. The point is how early you fortify and how you advance feeds makes a significant difference in how much enteral nutrition the baby receives in those first weeks of life. So what if the feeding volumes were the same? Here we have a comparison of fortified versus unfortified milk. and we use Dr. Hamilton Spence's feeding protocol as a base for parenteral nutrition intakes and total fluid goals. So we have the assumption of total fluids of 150 mLs per kilo, 90 mLs per kilo are from parenteral nutrition, and 60 mLs per kilo are from enteral nutrition. In this graph, we have grams of protein per kilo per day on the y-axis and the nutrition source on the x-axis. We're also assuming the goal is 4 grams per kilo per day of protein, and that is shown in both light purple bars in both graphs on the right-hand side. Okay, so on the left, we have unfortified milk. And we have, to start, parenteral nutrition, that magenta bar is providing 2.5 grams of protein per kilo. The next bar in purple is representing enteral nutrition, and unfortified human milk is providing 0.5 grams per kilo of protein. Combined, this is giving 3 grams protein per kilo, about 75% of the goal. Alternatively, on the right, we have fortified human milk. We have that same amount of protein coming from parenteral nutrition in that magenta bar. And then we have fortified human milk in purple, providing 1.4 grams of protein. So parenteral plus enteral combined in that dark purple bar gets us to 100% of our goal. You can see that even if the baby is at the same feeding volume, fortifying makes a significant impact on the amount of protein you're able to provide enterally, even at a smaller volume. So what would that look like if we're comparing our blue or early fortification versus purple or late fortification protocol? So this is an illustration of how much protein is coming from enteral versus parenteral sources on days 5, 7, 10, and 14. The top row represents our blue or early fortification protocol, and the bottom row represents our purple or late fortification protocol. Enteral protein is in the magenta color, and parenteral protein is in that purplish blue color. You can see here on day 5, our early fortification protocol is already giving 32% of protein enterally, versus our late fortification protocol is only providing 5% from an enteral source. On day 7, the early fortification protocol is now at 58% protein enterally, versus still only 9% in the late fortification protocol. Then on day 10, early fortification protocol is at 100% protein from the enteral route. And that's compared to the late fortification protocol, still only at 14%. Another consideration is the variability of protein concentration in mom's own milk and donor milk. Here we've taken a range of protein values and calculated how much protein would be delivered at the low and high end of those ranges that we reviewed earlier. These numbers are based on a feeding volume of 160 mLs per kilo per day. For preterm mom's milk mixed with Prolact plus 6, if the protein content of the base milk was on the low end of the range, you may be providing approximately 3.8 grams per kilo per day. Versus if it was on the high end of the range, you may be providing somewhere around 5.4 grams of protein per kilo. Using those term numbers, using term milk or donor milk mixed with Prolact plus 6, if the protein concentration was on the low end of the range, you'd be providing somewhere around 3.5 grams per kilo. And on the high end of the range, all the way up to 5.1 grams per kilo. We all use average protein concentrations to calculate nutrition, but in reality, we could be delivering anywhere between 3.5 to almost 5.5 grams of protein per kilo per day, as illustrated by this example. And as Dr. Hamilton Spence mentioned earlier, each mom's milk is unique, and most often we don't know the macronutrient concentration of mom's own milk or unanalyzed donor milk. So it's important to consider the variability of human milk, particularly when you think you're giving something, a certain amount on paper, and that doesn't match the clinical picture.
Thanks, Emily, for summarizing all the numbers for us. I think it really helps me get my head around, exactly why does it matter in the first week of life what we do. I think we'll summarize today before we get to our conclusions with this quote from Cami Martin that was in the commentary on the early amino acid provision trial in the New England Journal that was published at the same time. So I think that it's important for us to remember that as increasingly immature preterm infants survive, and as we as neonatologists continue to support them, and as a care team around these patients, that there's huge variability in their requirements, and we make a lot of assumptions that are not necessarily the most sound, but we have to proceed from somewhere. So this quote about the enteral route being the preferred delivery route, or the gastrointestinal tract as the preferred delivery route, I think is really important for us to remember that the more we can prime and use the intestine, more likely our patients will be better off. So our conclusions. Yes, there are some small but also perhaps important differences between the organizations that make recommendations for very preterm infants and their early protein intake. And enteral protein intake, enteral nutrition in the first few weeks of life specifically, and the successful transition off of parenteral nutrition has impacts in both short-term and long-term outcomes for very preterm infants.
We need to consider the base diet. We know there's variability in mom's own milk and donor milk. There's a range. And if we don't acknowledge this variation, what we're writing on paper, what we think we're giving the baby is not actually what's being delivered. And early fortification with exclusive human milk is really an amazing opportunity to improve the early enteral nutrition intake of the baby that we've seen has impacts on their long-term neurodevelopmental outcomes.
Thank you, Erin and Emily, for sharing your knowledge and practical applications regarding early protein for extremely low birth weight infants. Joining us on our panel for our live Q&A is Kim Mack. Kim is a clinical dietitian in units such as the NICU, maternal, pediatric, and PICU. She has a wide range of experience and expertise in leading NICU nutrition initiatives, including the development and management of feeding policies, budgeting, and education of NICU staff. She earned her master's and bachelor's degree from Northern Illinois University and has taught online nutrition courses for nursing students. If you have a question for our presenters, please submit them in the Ask Question section of your webinar console. We will follow up via email if there are any remaining questions that we were unable to answer during our live Q&A.
All right, let's go ahead and jump into the first question I see that has come in, and that is, how early are we looking at optimizing nutrition within a week? 10 days, 10 days of life, or what? So let's go ahead and start with Dr. Hamilton Spence. And so when you're thinking about optimizing nutrition in that first week or 10 days or so, what are you thinking about?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to start. So timing really matters. So it's both a blessing and a curse that early nutrition, what we're talking specifically about is the first 5 to 10 days. I think that the early pieces, when they're transitioning off of parenteral and onto enteral nutrition, and they're adapting to ex utero life, these are the critical junctures to make sure that we're delivering as well as we intend to, so that they can be well supported to grow thereafter.
All right, thank you. And Kim or Emily, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think for me, the earlier the better, meaning that we want to talk about getting that mom's milk on day 1 and really working from then to get them to the ultimate goal, which I think this presentation has really highlighted, is to be able to use enteral nutrition and get off of that parenteral nutrition as soon as possible and make those gains that we need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Emily?
I just love that early enteral nutrition. And we always learn, even like Aspen, if you're a nutrition support person, the thought of like use the gut first, use feeding first. And I think really starting to think about that concept in the premature infant, that parenteral nutrition is just our bridge to get on full enteral feeds, and that early enteral nutrition should really be our focus.
Okay, thank you. And Kim, let's start with you this time and say, do you think about NEC in that first week or so, and when you're fortifying early and whatnot, really supporting the enteral part of the diet? Do you think about NEC during that time?
Well, I think about a lot of things, Andy, and yes, obviously we all think about NEC, but I think really kind of coming across the fact that, there really is no delineation between how we can stop that. And so really thinking about getting that enteral nutrition going, feeding the gut, that's really the best way. I mean, there's two schools of thought with NEC, as if we don't feed, we will prevent it or cause it. And if we do feed, we prevent it or cause it. And so being able to take those babies off that, nutrition support and get them on enteral feeds and early fortification, I don't think that that's a detriment or causes NEC in any certain terms.
Okay. And to my other presenters, anything else to add?
Yes. So thanks for starting off, Kim. I think certainly, obviously, if we're worried about the intestinal development and whether they're going to tolerate milk at all. So a guideline never replaces your clinical judgment, obviously. But there's great evidence that early initiation of feeds, and as Kim mentioned, mother's milk is obviously the preferred first and thereafter feeding, if at all possible. And when you're using mother's milk, you're doing the things you can to prevent NEC as well. So you're priming the gut, you're delivering oligosaccharides, you're delivering prebiotics and maybe you're delivering some probiotics too. You're doing what you can to prevent NEC. And this early feeding has been shown to be safe, and early fortification has been shown to be safe as well, and does not increase the risk of NEC for even the less than 750 gram infant.
And would you, just to add on to that, Dr. Hamilton-Spence, how, NEC is obviously our extreme case, but how would you think about that in relation to intolerance, if you have the same type of question?
Yeah, so intolerance is the major problem in these little babies, and it's really difficult to distinguish between normal preterm dysmotility because their motility is so slow, and their maturity is so is lower than you would expect. So feeding intolerance, often we experience it as emesis or as distension. So I think that it is definitely, you see that eventually with feeding, they often develop tolerance. So they will go from intolerance to tolerance within a few days as the intestine gets primed, as the microbiome starts to change from the amniotic to the postnatal way. If you're using only human milk, then you're improving those things in a way that is very gentle and easy. So feeding intolerance is the most common reason that infants don't get fed or get their feeds held and not resumed quickly. So in the US, at least, many units have moved to this concept that we're not measuring residuals anymore, as it's not been shown to be really a helpful thing, and it actually delays feeding. So if the feeding intolerance you're measuring is really just emesis and abdominal distension, and of course other more extreme things like bloody stools and a red abdomen, a red or tender abdomen, those, if what you're dealing with is just the beginning, it's much less likely to be necrotizing enterocolitis, and therefore it may just be actual transitory prematurity feeding intolerance instead of other kinds of feeding intolerance.
Okay, thank you. And other presenters, anything to add?
Nothing to add to that.
All right. Yeah, very thorough. Thank you, Dr. Hamilton Spence. I'm going to ask Kim to weigh in first on the next one. And this is because this question is really about, taking it to the bedside. So, you're at the bedside. How do you deal with the uncertainty of unanalyzed mom's own milk or donor milk? How do you manage that when you think you're meeting the goals, but maybe growth isn't quite where you think it should be?
Yeah, I think this is a great point because there is a lot of unknown, and for some who really like the numbers, it can be very difficult because you do have to kind of give a little bit of kind of a work through to see, are we getting enough protein? Is that the issue? Are we getting enough calories? Are we delivering the calories that we think? And then looking to your other team members in a rounds type atmosphere to really look and see, is there something else going on? Because, we always kind of think about it's the feeds, but sometimes it's a lot of other things, temperature, respiratory, all of those things that kind of have to be kind of taken into account, because when we're looking at calories, sometimes it's not about the calories. And I think one of the great takeaways that I have from this webinar is that, there is a variance, but when we're looking at the variance, the protein stays the same. It's more about the calories that might be different. So I get this question asked all the time. How do you know if you need to go up in a plus fortifier or add the CR product? And so looking at that, I can say, are we meeting our protein goals? Are the fluid and volume where we're at? Can I meet my protein goals? If I can, and I'm still not getting the growth I need, then I would add that CR product. But if the fluid isn't where it needs to be, or then I might go up in the +8 in weight. So it really is kind of being able to take in all of the different avenues that everybody can bring to really see how we can optimize that nutrition at the bedside.
I like that, Kim, because I feel like from the presentation, I almost have more questions and answers, which can be a good thing, right? And I feel like it just really highlighted how, how gray level area some of this is. It's very complex and it's hard to it's very difficult to think of it just in a black and white way. Emily, as a dietitian, oh, sorry, Kim, go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to jump in, but I guess that's kind of what I was kind of meaning towards. My thought process is kind of like the Goldilocks principle, not too much, not too little, just right. And everybody's just right can be individual. So they may not fit into your feeding protocol. They may not fit into what you have on paper, but if they're not growing, then you need to give them more. And sometimes it's just figuring out what that more is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Emily, as a dietitian, also, do you have anything else to add?
I would just say I think, it'll be interesting to see how targeted fortification develops, that practice develops, because I think, we didn't do that at my old hospital where I came from, but I think that that's being discussed out there. And there are some people doing targeted fortification where you're actually measuring mom's own milk and then adjusting fortification specifically for that nutrient composition for that individual mom. So I don't think we know yet, or at least I don't feel like I know yet the best way to do that. And I don't think there's a lot of units out there doing it, but I think it's just a really interesting idea to say it's individualized. Each baby is individualized, and you need to look at their clinical picture, what you're giving them, and what's actually happening in the baby, like what Kim was saying. And so until targeted fortification, I feel like is more teased out, we have to look at that clinical picture.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Hamilton Spence, anything to add?
I agree. I think that targeted fortification is probably the future of taking away at least one of the unknown variables at this point. I know that there are some hospitals with their MIRAS who are doing targeted fortification right now. At the moment, some of those have a variety of modulars that they're using. Some of them are using just our human milk-based fortifier plus the fat modular. So I do think that targeted fortification is coming, but it certainly adds It's in the very early days. It adds a level of complexity that many practices aren't quite ready to address. Many hospitals aren't quite ready to address, but as their knowledge and understanding and comfort with mom's milk and donor milk becomes more robust, I think that it will become a more common practice. And I know that there are trials out there right now that are working on what is the best way to adapt when you're doing targeted fortification and what the goals should be. So I think there's, in the next 5 to 10 years, will be lots, in the next 2 to 3 years, there will be lots more to come on targeted fortification practices.
And kind of speaking in that, oh, sorry, was that, I think I just echoed. I thought I was interrupting myself. Speaking of targeted fortification, Dr. Hamilton-Spence, will just continue with you. So tell me about using BUN and with the kind of uncertainty of the protein in mom's own milk or unanalyzed donor milk. How do you kind of manage that?
For sure. So a couple of distinctions. First, often it's not very helpful in the early days. So in this early fortification time frame that we're referring to, most infants will have a fairly low BUN unless they're having some acute tubular necrosis, or they're having they've had a little bit of kidney injury after delivery or insufficiency after delivery. So sometimes that can be a factor. Like if you see an elevated BUN and an elevated creatinine, then you're dealing with a little bit of early renal failure. That is usually transient, not always. So at that point, in that first 5 days, often a high BUN isn't super helpful because what you're dealing with is just the post-birth challenges. After that, it can sometimes be helpful if it really gets high. So we're talking about, approaching 50 or 60, and something that's higher than that might be an indication that you, especially as you get off of parenteral and onto enteral nutrition, might be an indication that you're delivering more protein than you can use because you have more urea around. There are a couple, but not great studies out there about how to detect when you're over providing protein. And I think that the key might be in that protein to energy ratio that we're starting to understand a little more about, and that Emily talked about during the presentation. Because maybe it's not more protein we need, but more fat, which is, my guess is it's going to be one of those two.
Okay, thank you. And Emily or Kim, anything to add? Okay, and adding, echoing to myself again. So then still thinking just about that early time, when do you feel like is the ideal time to stop TPN? I think that I love some of those visuals that Emily showed of the, parenteral and enteral combination and, our percentage of each. But I think, for a long time, a lot of people kind of stop their TPN maybe at 100 mLs per kilogram per day, maybe 120. What's your guys' take on when to stop TPN? And I should direct it. I'm going to direct this one to Emily. Or no, Erin, did you want to start?
No.
Okay, Erin. Emily. Sorry, I get so excited about the questions, I forgot I had to direct that. So Emily, let's start with you on this one.
Well, it depends on how you define full feeds also. I think some people are saying full feeds is 120, meaning they don't need, like in the theory of total fluids. So how you manage your total fluids, I think, makes your decision around how long to continue TPN different unit to unit. But I don't know if I have a magic number other than I'm just trying to think of, like, there does get to that point where the amount of parenteral nutrition is the volume is small to where it makes it difficult to concentrate nutrients, and it becomes like that, decision of, should I just go with IV fluids to make up the rest, or can the baby fly on their own, or do I really need this small volume parenteral nutrition? I think that's the piece that everyone's probably nuancing. I don't know, Dr. Hamilton-Spence or Kim, if you have any
thoughts
Yeah,
around
so certainly over 100 and below 140, I guess that
Yeah.
seems to be the sweet spot based on the volume your total volume that is your goal for the day. So yeah, somewhere between 110 and 130 meals per kilo per day of feeds is probably a good time. It's probably a good indication that you're going to be able to continue to advance and continue your feeding. And that's probably a point at which your IV access can be let go.
Okay. And Kim or Emily, anything to add? Or I mean,
yeah.
Emily already answered, so just Kim.
Yeah, I think that like clinically, like when I'm making that decision, it depends upon, we fortify at 60 mLs per kg per day with +6. And so I will tell you that like when I get around 100 mLs per kilo per day of the TPN, it really can be difficult. Again, it kind of depends upon all of the amount of fluid that you're starting with, but it becomes much more difficult those last 2 days to get everything to fit. The pharmacist and I are doing the let's make a deal in some instances, and we found that mostly because of fortifying earlier and being able to get that going. And so, to me, again, I think that that's a good thing in the sense that we can fortify earlier, we can get off of that TPN and probably just use IV fluids. And, we are using cream proactively at the end of the TPN, starting that, and that has helped both with our hypoglycemic issues as well as our growth issues. So, I think you have to, again, kind of have that individual kind of thought process of where you're starting from. But in general, it's about 100 mLs per kg per day is where we start to have that issue.
Okay. And when you said that you proactively add ProLac-CR, at what volume do you do that?
So we do it as soon as the TPN is done. So we start 60 mLs per kg per day with +6. We end about 100 mLs of feeds with the TPN. And then as soon as the TPN stops, then we start that CR.
Okay, great. Well, I cannot believe our time is up, but our time is up. That went so fast. And I even, I'm glad I looked at the clock because I was so enthralled in everyone's answers that I probably would have taken another hour to answer questions. If you did post a question, the speakers will get back to you via email and answer your question. Just really want to thank everyone for joining us here today. I can only assume that you all enjoyed the presentation as much as I did. I really came away with some great questions and insight to a pretty complex topic. So thank you so much to everyone that joined, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.